Our second scripture lesson today is from the 8th chapter of Mark, verses 31 to 38. Listen for the word of the Lord. Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This year, as I hope you are aware, we are looking at what it means to be human. This Lenten season is the climax of that effort. There are many disciplines that give us insight into our humanity, and there are things that we can glean from them. But for the Christian, our definition of what it means to be human comes from God's revelation to us in Jesus Christ, and then what the Bible tells us about him, and thus about ourselves. With a nod to the OG of our tradition, John Calvin opens his Institutes of the Christian Religion this way: "Nearly all wisdom we possess, that is to say, true and sound wisdom, consists of two parts, the knowledge of God and of ourselves." We cannot then understand our humanity apart from God. For the Christian to try and define our humanity without our relationship to God is self-congratulating, it suffers from a limited perspective, and it can lead to a destructive way of life for ourselves and others. That depends, of course, in large part on what you think is a worthwhile life, but you can see the definition of our humanity has great import on our living and on the well-being of others. And so we look at our human life specifically in relationship to God, who we know in Jesus Christ. Last week we heard that Jesus is the fully human one. To become human again is to find ourselves in him, in his way, his love, his presence, his call. To be human is to be found in his history of deliverance. With Jesus, history has a direction, a purpose, to deliver anyone from a situation from bondage and into a life of freedom. When we participate in that history of deliverance, we become human again. Today, then, is an exploration of how we participate in that history of deliverance. And in our reading, we encounter Jesus in a perilous moment with his disciples, and especially with Peter. Jesus begins to tell a story that you do not tell if you're telling a story of how you save people, how you deliver people. He's telling a story of rejection, suffering, death, and rising again. Peter cannot abide it, and so he pulls him aside and he rebukes Jesus, but Jesus in turn calls Peter Satan. And what we find here is the human one showing us that to be human, we have to reinterpret our entire understanding of glory. The pursuit of glory is all around us. We're encouraged to seek after it. This is holding up the championship trophy after winning the championship game. It's trying to grasp that Oscar or that Grammy award. It's winning the corner office or the Citizen of the Year or the Student of the Month. It's that glory that comes in the political victory. This is the kind of glory that's marked by public acknowledgement and celebration because of our talent, our hard work, our persistence, our grit. We are driven to be recognized for that and to receive that glory. But there's another kind of glory that we also see as honorable. It can look like this.
If we are marked to die, we are enough to do our country loss. And if to live, the fewer men, the greater share of honor. God's will, I pray thee, wish not one man more. Rather, proclaim it, Westmoreland, through my host, that he which hath no stomach to this fight, let him depart. His passport shall be made, and crowns for convoy put into his purse. We would not die in that man's company that fears his fellowship to die with us. This day is called the Feast of Crispian. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand at tiptoe when this day is named, and rouse him at the name of Crispian. He that shall see this day and live old age will yearly, on the vigil, feast his neighbors and say, tomorrow is St. Crispin's. Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I had on Crispin's day. Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot, but he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Then shall our names, familiar in their mouths as household words, Harry the King, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester, be in their flowing cups freshly remembered. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers.
Or for a slightly more contemporary image of this kind of glory, perhaps it looks like this.
I am William Wallace, and I see a whole army of my countrymen here in defiance of tyranny. You've come to fight as free men, and free men you are. What will you do with that freedom? Will you fight?
Fight against that? No! We will run, and we will live.
Aye. Fight and you may die. Run and you'll live. At least a while. And dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
This is the glorious defeat. And it strikes at something more primal within us than our individual glorification, that there are things worth giving our lives to, even if we know they will not come out victorious. But in both situations, it is a glorious death. It is a commitment to the honorable way in the face of certain defeat. It is a tragic honor. The church has often interpreted the story of Jesus through this lens of tragic honor. We've done it particularly in theological language of Christ's humiliation and exaltation. Listen to the way the Westminster Shorter Catechism that guided Presbyterian theology for some 400 years puts it. Wherein did Christ's humiliation consist? Christ's humiliation consisted in his being born, and that in a low condition, made under the law, undergoing the miseries of this life, the wrath of God, and the cursed death of the cross, in being buried and continuing under the power of death for a time. Wherein consisteth Christ's exaltation? Christ's exaltation consisteth in his rising again from the dead on the third day, and ascending up into heaven, and sitting at the right hand of God the Father, and in coming to judge the world at the last day. You hear that? The death of Jesus is his humiliation. It is suffering that he must endure in order to get to his glorification and exaltation. In more contemporary language, it's when we say things like Jesus exchanges the cross for the crown. It's separating the event of Good Friday from the glorious resurrection of Easter Sunday. In this vision, Jesus suffers death like the righteous warrior who stays true to his honor even until he is killed. And then the Easter event vindicates that life because he lives on. In that vision, Jesus is much like Henry V or William Wallace. He's the great underdog story. But to interpret the cross, to interpret Jesus through the lens of the honorable defeat, is to participate in the perspective of Peter in our passage. We still want to define what it means to save or to deliver our own life. We still feel the need to fit Jesus' story into a narrative glory that comes to us from somewhere other than the fully human one himself. Princeton theologian George Hunsinger says, God's act of deliverance is an act of self-humiliation. It is God's total immersion into human frailty, sin, and death, and immersion finally into total disgrace. But this immersion is not only an act of divine love, it is also an act of divine freedom. In it, God confirms who God is and triumphs as the Creator. God is never more glorious than when hidden in Jesus as he dies ingloriously on the cross. Jesus' humiliation is his glorification. It isn't sequential events. It's one thing. And Jesus says that anybody who wants to come after him, anyone who wants to follow him, in another way, anyone who wants to be human again, has to take up their cross. Our glorification is our humiliation. Jesus here disarms what we call shame. He takes from us our power to define value. Anyone who would save his life, Jesus says. And he revalues us by his humanity. He humiliates our glory and thus draws us back to himself. Theologian Karl Barth goes so far to say that we ought to be singing Easter hymns in the midst of the Good Friday service of darkness. Perhaps it helps to think about it linguistically. The Latin root of the word humiliate is the same root that we have for human, humble, humus. So Jesus, the fully human one, restores us to our dust selves, our human selves. Jesus brings us back to the earth. But let me be clear. This is not degrading, dismissive, or diminishing of ourselves. It is glorying in our interdependence with our Creator, with the land in which we live, and the other human souls that we walk alongside. In this understanding, then, the cross is not a burden, nor a means to an end, nor the endurance of suffering. The cross is to accept our humble position to live unashamed as we were made to be. To live unashamed. When Simon was 2, he was in a preschool Christmas program at his preschool that he attended. He's given me permission to tell you this story today, by the way. So on the day of the performance, we picked him up early from school. We took him home so that he could eat something before the performance. We put him in his Christmas best, his red and blue sweater vest, a white Oxford shirt, khaki pants, matching khaki shoes. We then drove him back to the preschool, walked him to his room, and left him with his teachers to get ready for the performance. This was a mistake. He was at the height of separation anxiety, so to leave mom and dad for the second time in that day was not a desirable moment. But we left him there, upset, took our seats in the auditorium, preparing to see him begin the performance. We were summoned but a few moments later. He had not regained his composure. In fact, he'd gotten so worked up that bodily fluids had come out of multiple places all over his body. Rebecca went back to the classroom. We, of course, didn't bring an extra Christmas outfit just in case. So they pulled out for him from, the leftover clothes of other kids, a gray t-shirt, some brown sweatpants, and some oversized gray shoes. I went back into the auditorium, sat with all 4 grandparents to anticipate this preschool performance. The title of the show, I kid you not, was called A Christmas to Remember. And the opening of the performance had each kid walk out alone across the stage of the First Baptist Church and hang an ornament on a tree in the center of the stage. So each of the girls came out in the spotlight in their plaid red and green dresses, their hose in their patent leather shoes, their hair curled with their matching bows. The boys came out in their white shirts and their bow ties and their suspenders. And then last, because of our last name, he was the last one out, comes Simon, gripping his mother's finger in a gray shirt and borrowed pants, eyes red and puffy from crying. I was mortified, embarrassed. What were we thinking? Why did we not realize we should have just left him at school and taken the outfit? What kind of parents were we that we didn't have extra clothes there? What were these other parents at the performance thinking about us, that we weren't prepared or we didn't remember it was the Christmas pageant or whatever? But if Jesus is Lord, if he defines our humanity, if he has humiliated our glory and taken away our shame, that moment wasn't humiliating. It was glorious.